One of the speakers is not yet in, but I'm sure he will come soon, back from lunch, and we will no longer wait for that speaker. It's a great pleasure and honor for me to chair this session. My name is Sergei Karaganov. I'm the academic supervisor of the Faculty of World Economy and Politics, and maybe a emeritus professor of HSE, which I love so much. And in terms of foreign policy aspects of research at HSE, it produces almost all ideas becoming key ideas of the Russian foreign policy. One of these ideas that has recently been born here is that our idea to call what we used to call non-West, and wrongly called non-West for many developing countries, we suggested that it should be called global majority. Our Indian friends and colleagues decided to compete with us intellectually and call it global South. It's a friendly competition, and hopefully we'll arrive at truth. But we are insisting on our proposal. Why? The global majority that is becoming a dominant force in the global economy and politics, and soon in global culture, would not have been born unless if one country first in the 1950s and 60s, and then second time in the 2010s and 2020s had not removed the foundation of West domination, which for the past 400, 500 years was based on a military superiority, enabling the West to impose its political, cultural interests, and first and foremost, ravaging and robbing the rest of the world. Russia was close to becoming part of that West. I was present in that process, which was in place since late 80s till mid-90s last century. But history decided that, and luckily we have not become part of the West. And instead we have become a military political core of what our Indian friends call global South. But I'm sorry, my Indian friends, how can be a global South if your military political core is in the north? We shall continue our friendly argument. We understand we are witnessing a geopolitical revolution, which I call a global earthquake. And the main component of that and cause is departure of the West from dominating position it has occupied for the past 400 or 500 years, which made it possible for everybody, including Russia, by the way, to rise in many aspects. We should not be unthankful, we should not be ungrateful to the West, and more so that Russia is partially part of the West. We should not be ungrateful for what they've done, but they're also robbing the rest of the world. Now this process is coming to an end. We are witnessing convulsions of neocolonialism. It's a long and painful process. And for 20 years, we'll be living through this earthquake. Hopefully this will not bring about a collapse of humanity. Hopefully we'll avoid a large thermonuclear war. But these are our premises, and we should decide and determine what is global South, or what is the global majority. How will that be organizing itself? And will it be organizing itself at all? At some point, India was organizing a significant part of the global south and was a leading force of the non-alignment movement. Unfortunately, the non-alignment movement will have to be reinvented or reformatted in some way. And then clearly, this new world emerging from underwater as a result of the earthquake have not yet acquired its identity. It is something I want us to debate and argue and discuss. Because giving sense to world processes is and meaning is the major and most important part of our occupation and job as experts and analysts of and historians of international relations. We have a brilliant team of speakers. When I was offered to moderate this round table, and when I saw that we were given an hour and a half, I said I would not be moderating. I said it would be 2 hours. So each speaker, and these are stellar speakers, world caliber, I would suggest and give 9 minutes with one exception. 10 minutes I will give to Dmitry Trenin, because Dmitry Trenin is now writing a project which will be a foundation of a large situational analysis shaping Russia's policy with regard to the global majority. He has advanced farther than everybody else. We are doing this analysis under the auspices of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the administration or office of the President, and this will be published. Hopefully what Dr. Trenin has jotted down will be published, and he will speak today, and everybody will be, including myself, will be interested to know what he has to offer. Again, clearly we need to use various perspectives. Nobody is an expert in the issue or problem which we are going to discuss. It's a novel thing, it's a challenge. It's the greater interest that I give the floor to the speakers. I suggest we all have a debate and argue, and then we'll have some time to talk to the audience. And I suggest we have a discussion with the audience and between the speakers instead of questions and answers, because we don't have experts on our global majority. That's a new phenomenon in world history. Dmitry, you are the first to speak. Sergei Karaganov, thank you very much. It's a great honor for me to participate in this conference and speak at this plenary session. Much of what be the basis of the text that Sergei Karaganov mentioned was contained in his introductory remarks. I will continue the line that Dr. Karaganov has expressed. I have several simple points to share with you. The first one is the direct clash with the West has split Russia's foreign policy in two. With two fields in the West, in the North, Arctic and beyond Arctic, there's a hostile coalition of about 50 countries headed by the United States. That's a field of war, hot war in Ukraine and hybrid war across the world. On Russia's side, it's a war for the possibility of independent and free development and for a just and fair world order. On the US side, as it appears to me, it's a war to maintain its world hegemony. And this confrontation is a confrontation of principle. It's part of the process of changing the world order globally and likely to last for quite a long time. And when it ends, I do not believe that Russia, in its new quality and position, will again strive to become part of the West. This long chapter in Russian history is over. My next point is that a larger half of the foreign policy field for Russia is the field of peace and cooperation. Here Russia interacts with countries that seek to protect and defend their sovereignty and identity, and therefore refused to become part of the US sanctions coalition. Even more so, they continue to trade, to communicate with the Russian Federation, with various countries being there. That's a various group of countries, diverse, great powers, China and India, major regional powers in various regions of the world, and most importantly, that all of these countries that constitute the majority of humanity, that produce a larger part of the global product, are a new phenomenon in international life. What we are increasingly calling the world majority. And this term that was born inside the Higher School of Economics, inside this university, is now been accepted at the level of the President of the Russian Federation, which is a pleasure. Russia, as Sergei Karaganov said, is part of the world majority. Therefore, to speak about the South or the East would not be correct. It's open to all countries that strive to pursue an independent policy or defend their identity. Russia, the way we see it, is a major geopolitical resource of the global majority, a key major military resource, and I hope one of major intellectual resources for this global majority. The third point concerns the recently adopted Russian foreign policy concept, which for the first time in our history prioritize the relations with the global majority immediately after the countries of the post-Soviet space. And actually, those countries are also part of the global majority, the post-Soviet countries. Thus, the idea that underlies Russia's foreign policy and Russia's policy vis-à-vis the global South, global East, or the global majority is the idea of liberation. Liberation from neo-colonialism, from hegemony, and overall, this coincides with the major thrust of Russia's foreign policy at large, that is fighting with the hegemony of a single center, which is fighting the imposition of one set of values with injustice and unfairness in various fields. Therefore, the major content of Russia's policy with regard to the majority is building already now of elements and institutions of a new, just world order. It's not a coalition of anti-Western countries, which, according to Moscow or the Kremlin, is to fight against the West, or to be our resource in our fight against the West. The main thing of global majorities policy is building today, where the old order is still there, although to building new elements of the new world order. And this constructive motive is a central motive, not a desire to create an anti-US coalition, or not an attempt to replace the hegemony of one country by a narrow concert of some powers. That's a principally new approach. In a situation where organizations, including the United Nations organization, which in many ways have become a tool of Western policy, turn out to be incapable of resolving issues facing humanity, it's impossible to develop forms and institutions of a new type, open, free from domination of even major powers, even within the global majority, and capable of uniting and pulling together international efforts in the interests of all countries. Therefore, the central platform for building a new model of the world order, the way I see it, could be BRICS. And the potential expansion of this group should be accompanied by deepening and expanding cooperation between the current members. Further institutionalization of BRICS will make it possible to focus on world finances, trade and investment relations, technological standards, logistics, information resources, food security, and so on. Financial cooperation is of utmost importance because the hegemony of one center is very much built on the hegemony of one currency, which is an impediment, serious impediment to a new world order. Therefore, seeking new forms of the world equivalent, global digital currency, should become a priority for BRICS. I think that the vision of BRICS could be that the BRICS tomorrow is the United Nations the day after tomorrow. It's not a group of countries that is in confrontation with anybody, but a future basis for a new global order. Continentally, in Eurasia, the central platform, for me, in my view, is the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. For a long time, Moscow considered this idea of copying the Conference and Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe as a model for developing cooperation between university states. But OSCE has become an appendage of the Euro-Atlantic system, degenerated and virtually lost its functionality. SCO, on the contrary, is becoming a more attractive forum and is gaining in importance. Today, the SCO includes major civilizations, Indian, Islamic, Chinese, Russian, and the SCO can become an assembling point for a new model of international security on the scale of a huge continent. Economically, the most important task of SCO is to develop internal connectivity of Greater Eurasia, which remains largely too dependent on sea routes. Finally, there is this task of great importance of developing cultural, scientific, scholarly, technical, humanitarian exchanges and other exchanges between the countries of the continent, who often communicate more with distant partners than with their immediate neighbors. Let me mention separately the prospects for cooperation in the field of information. Information has never been as powerful as it is today. And this makes it necessary to combine the resources of the leading countries of the world majority to promote their own world agenda, their narratives, their vision of the global future, and the protection of traditional values. An international information multimedia consortium with a unified editorial board involving the leading global-oriented media of the BRICS and SCO countries would be best suited to realize these goals.
And finally, we need to establish platforms for communication between the elites. Some of these platforms exist, such as the Valdai Club, but it seems to me that we now need to start thinking about platforms of a higher level, something similar to the Heidelberg Club, of course adjusted to our situation for the majority countries, or countries that are part of this majority, some kind of club, BRIC, Russia, India, China, would be quite interesting for the interaction between the elites of this country, or a Eurasian club that would be in line with the ideas of the Greater European Partnership, etc. And our world has entered a period of fundamental change. We all understand this. And a period like this, we cannot remain passive. This means losing. We have to act. But in order to act effectively, we need to be better coordinated. Thank you so much. Thank you very much. That was a great beginning. Something that requires a great discussion. I really liked your idea of creating a consortium, an info consortium of BRICS. Mr. Trenin suggested that several years ago. We tried to convince our friends in China and in India to launch this idea. It hasn't taken off the ground, but we need it. We don't need to politicize it or anything. We shouldn't turn it into an arena of natural competition of the BRICS great countries, India, China, Russia, and China. I think Brazil would be best fitted for that, somewhere in Rio de Janeiro in Brazil, that could host the headquarters of this super concern that is absolutely necessary. We need to have a relatively objective analysis of what's going on. Cape Town is, of course, yet another option for that, to analyze what's going on. Because the situation in the world, information-wise, is the last bastion of the old world. Everything is eroding, the economy, culture, and so on, but the organization and information is still there, and we're still, talking to each other via Western media, which have become very partisan, to use the old Soviet language. And now I would like to give the floor to a great Indian intellectual and also a general. What could be a better combination? A general and an intellectual. That's very Russian style. So, Mr. Sharma, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Chair, and thanks, Mr. Dmitry, for those wonderful thoughts. And I'll just, because time doesn't permit me to start with certain pleasantries, so I'll make 6 brief points. First is a brief sort of a reality check of the extant world order. Second, how has it been impacted by different strategic shocks that we have witnessed? What is the strategic behavior of different actors who think they are the creators or the custodians of this world order? Then, what are the critical uncertainties which are staring us in the eyes? And finally, what is India's position in shaping a multipolar world order, and where is that alignment between India and Russia where we can work together? Now, we all know that theoretically everybody talks about a rule-based international system, that the very protagonists of this are the first violators of that very rule, which we have seen in terms of economic sanctions and many other practices which are being followed. And this monopoly of small groups, because of the distribution of power now, no more holds good, because there are other power centers which have emerged and they need their rightful place in the comity of nations to shape their own global future. But in reality, what happens is what Lee Kuan Yew, he was prescient when he said that no matter how benign we think, but the state behavior is going to be guided by social Darwinism. There would be permanency of national interests. There will be a hierarchy of powers, and there will be a balance of powers, always, the states jostling for influence. And we see presently the reigning hegemon, United States of America, is doing everything to retain its position. There is another important major power like China, which is emerging, which is seeking its own strategic space. And then we have the middle level power, who are either binding, balancing, aligning, realigning and hedging in that whole fiasco. And there is this jostling of power. But with all this, what is important here is that, we are definitely running towards a Thucydides trap, that the risk of escalation and a war breaking out, which has global implications, is very much real. Now, we have witnessed a number of strategic shocks in the past, but 3 strategic shocks in quick succession in the recent past have impacted this global order in a big way. And the first was the COVID pandemic, which probably put the process of globalization on a back burner. There was a disruption of supply chains. The nations, they evolved, they adopted hedging strategy, what you call is, the ghetto mentality. And then, of course, there were other fallouts of this. Mostly nations were involved in self-preservation. In this fiasco, which was unprecedented global crisis, the 2 nations which were supposed to rise to the occasion is United States of America and China. But neither Pax America stood its ground, nor Pan Seneca was able to create the kind of impact which the world was impacting from it. The second strategic shock was, unceremonious or undignified exit of US from Afghanistan, which put the entire Eurasia in a shock, in a state of turbulence. And the third has been this Ukraine conflict. Now, Ukraine conflict, we know that, repeatedly, because of their strategic behavior, they stepped over the Russian red lines. They did not accommodate them into the global and Eurasian economic and security architecture, and Russia was left but with the Hobson choice to respond the manner in which they have responded. Consequently, what we see is a highly polarized world, and we see typically a new Cold War which is staring us in the eyes. Now, what are the characteristics of this new Cold War? There is a contestation of ideology, the so-called liberal democracies versus other forms of governance. Then there is a domination for resources, whether these are existential resources or new resources like rare earth metals, supercomputers, chips. There is control over, reconfiguration of global supply chain. Then there is a contestation over technology. The 2 ecosystems are emerging, one that of West, another that of China, and they are at loggerheads and actually creating a digital divide in the world, which will have implications on other countries. Then, of course, is the weaponization of economy, which is an antithesis of the very globalization process. And therefore, in the new world order, we have to see how do you circumvent dollar as a weapon and this, this economic kind of a coercion. Other nations should not be a victim of that. Then, of course, is the battle of narratives. In the cognitive space, in today's social media, actually, the winner may actually not be the winner. So how do we deal with this social media revolution that we have to cope up with? And then, of course, we have to think that these are not really the existential threats. The existential threats are something like pandemic, climate change, but there's very little being talked about those non-security, non-traditional security threats, which are the real challenge to the humanitarian dignity and existence. And we also see a new generation warfare, which is far more complex, where there are no state-to-state conflicts. It combines politics, diplomacy, economy, technology, using multitude of means, state actors, non-state actors, linear, non-linear, whole kind of, this, and we are not really, our institutions are not coping up, or they are not geared to sort of deal with these kind of new generation warfare. Now, in this milieu, if you look at the strategic behavior of different players, first is United States of America. The United States of America continues to look at the world in binary terms. If you carry out an examination of their national security strategy, national defense strategy, and nuclear posture review, it is we versus them, And then they have come up with this concept of America is back, build back better world and kind of things. They are reinvigorating the alliance system. And what is more important this time over, that they are trying to bridge the East Asian alliance system with the NATO alliance system. You see the participation of 3 countries of East Asia in Madrid summit. They also come out with the new doctrines, the use of joint force, integrated deterrence, in which dollar becomes a very, very potent weapon. And ultimately, their entire approach to deal with world affairs is through application of hard power, right? Hard power, and I would tend to agree, though I have no basis to prove, that presently American grand strategy stands on 3 pillars. One, you have already domesticated Europe by making them totally reliant on you in terms of economy and security. Second, you have trying to create another Vietnam or Afghanistan for Russia in Ukraine. And then you would also somehow try and keep Afghanistan destabilized, because that would stymie China's Belt and Road Initiative. So it is one low-cost option with one stone. Actually, you're killing 3 birds. Now let's look at China. Now China definitely is looking at China-centric Asia, and they have this China dream, they have Belt and Road Initiative, and they have transited from hide and bide strategy to what you call is, we will assume a center state, and we will also have what you call is dare to fight strategy, and create PLA as a great wall, right? So they are also trying to sort of, act what you call is, in a diplomatic arena. For example, this brokering the deal between Iran and Saudi Arabia and coming with 12-point formula. Whether it has a taker or not is a point of time. But probably, even if they talk about global development initiative and global security initiative, but in tangible terms, I think China has not been able to give to the world a very, very reliant, trustworthy kind of an alternative system. Russia, we know, has become a frontline state and it's become a champion of, non-hegemonic world order. It's working in that direction, and we wish them well. And Europe is actually in the state of a dilemma. There are contradictions within Europe. I don't know how fast these contradictions are going to emerge and how this is going to pan out. So there is a geopolitical polarization, and the critical uncertainties are, we still don't know how situation in Ukraine conflict is going to pan out, how this is going to spread to Indo-Pacific, where Taiwan, North Korea, Senkaku, Diaoyu, South China Sea, these are hot flashpoints. Then this may actually span out to the new strategic frontiers like outer space, cyberspace, Arctic region. These are the new frontiers, and how even African continent, West Asia. So we'll see that how do we contain this. Finally, if we look at India's overall approach to the whole thing, we believe in world is a family. Like we've got this logo of G20, that it is one earth, one people, and one future. And we strictly believe in that, and we've also come out with security and growth with all in the region. And our focus basically is, we are strongly looking at a multipolar world. That is why we have this what you call strategic autonomy and multi-vector engagement foreign policy. We very much adhere to UN global development goals. We look at multilateralism. We look at respect for global commons. We do not believe any zero-sum game, any confrontation, joining any military bloc. We want to advocate the cause of digital technology for various solutions. We also have the Solar Alliance, International Alliance system. we become a kind of leaders in the soft power in today's very, very disturbed world, and we would very much lend our shoulder to multilateral and regional organizations like BRICS, RIC, G20, Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and UN reforms in the UN. And finally, under the rubric of a special privileged partnership with Russia, we need to boost our defense cooperation, because there is a tendency for India to wean away from Russia and go towards other countries. We need to further roughen up or straighten certain the rough edges in our energy swap, energy cooperation, diversification of trade, and also how do we harmonize what Prime Minister Modi said, India's Far Act East policy, together with Act East policy, and in that I would say operationalization of North-South corridor, Vladivostok-Chennai corridor, international North-South corridor. They become strategic imperatives. If we are not able to operationalize them, then we may not be able to achieve the optimum gains of our relationship. But on the whole, finally, I would say that Russia has also to understand the position in which India is placed. We have to do a very fine balancing act by virtue of different reasons, whether it's factor A, B, C, I don't want to dilate on that. As long as our friends in Russia and understand a unique position in which we are, I think we have a great scope to work together. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your excellent presentation. I would like to assure you, Mr. General, that we do understand the position of India. We are not really easy to take offense, and we are partly Asians, or we are Eurasians, and we look at history from the standpoint of long trends, long-haul trends. We do realize that India will be there in 10 and 15 years, and it will be, in those years, our friend and partner. And we still need to leave those 10 to 15 years together and avoid any exacerbation of conflicts. We do realize your interest in seeing the end to conflicts in Europe, but please understand our position too. If we don't solve this problem, address this problem, which we call NATO's enlargement or expansion to the east, and a direct challenge, military challenge to Russia, then the process of liberalization of the global majority will be slowed down or will stop altogether. But as we beef up our technology potential, we are, of course, concerned with our own interests, and the same applies to what we do in Ukraine. But whether this is fortuitous or that was God's providence, we also happen to be the ones that help to liberate the rest of the world. And so please understand that your fight is our fight, but we do not want anyone to take our side. And it is now my great pleasure to give the floor to Anastasia Likacheva. She is a great researcher and scientist, the youngest dean in our country of a huge and very successful department, the best in our country and maybe one of the best in the world. I know this for a fact. And she now has the rank of a general, according to Russian standards. So she's now a young general. So I think we still have similarly young general in our armed forces, thanks to the war, but maybe she is the youngest general, of course, on the civil service.
My stars are from the east, unlike our younger generals today, the new generals. Thank you very much. I very much in agreement with what has been said before me, but in my presentation I will talk more about political, economical aspects of the world majority, what brings it together. The first phrase that was said, which I saw, in Dubai, it was an advertising piece. With whom would you trade if trust were not an issue? But it's an issue. And there's an obvious trust problem for the world majority and the world at large. Two levels. Lack of trust to older systems. They have discredited themselves. They're very convenient. You can make so much money. But the risk is so high and became so much visible, at least for large players in the world majority. The second thing is distrust of partners. It has not become more if there's the situation when the older system failed. We understand why. A distrust of new partners, no structure of cooperation, no positive experience of cooperation in the past decade, no trusted guides, middle people, or they're very few in number. In my view, the appearance or non-appearance of such infrastructure of trust within the global majority will define at least a new economic world order that will emerge and is emerging. And this process will become or not become, and the global majority will only become an ideal concept, will become a central process of 21st century. 20th century, it was decolonization in the sense, for the first time we saw a distribution of control over territories for the past 300 years. And control over the territories was accompanied by redistribution of the burden of responsibilities to the colonies, but for possibilities to extract profits or super profits was kept with the ex-colonial powers. To what extent it will be able to build a new structure and remove this monopoly control is a big issue. In the previous model, the absence of attractive alternatives of participation in the new structure. The alternatives are there. For instance, Iran and China. But it also benefited from benefits of civilization through China. If China has not fitted this civilization, it would be difficult for Iran to do it. The second thing, decolonization, that we can talk about for today, it can be directed not at control of territories, but the control of profits, and most importantly, control of development. Not so much is needed. We need new hubs in the countries of the global majority, and they're emerging without protective sanctions. Hubs are about logistics, finance and standards, new stock exchanges, commodity exchanges linked to consumer markets or production market. There's one issue in the new history. This new infrastructure initially will be much less convenient and much less effective than one universal. And Russia is facing this. When you need so many currency swaps, do clearing manually, banks don't like it, particularly central banks. Businesses don't like it. And in this positive movement toward the global majority, there will be higher transaction costs, volatility, and saving. One thing is about settlements, but who will you trust with last judgment reserves that you want to make? And again, to service this, not for Russia, but for India, for the Middle Eastern countries, for African countries, it's not their part of the global, but second-tier economy, perhaps experimental economy that will be aimed at new formats. Experiments are expensive, and mistakes are inevitable. They're never considered initially successful. But what can be good about the new experimental economy? It can bring much more money to those who are directly involved. Localization of profits, super profits is important, but the major bonus for the global majority is not money as such, but localization of development. Much has been said about the Ukraine crisis, and evidently Russia's focus is there. Our brain is focused on dealing with these threats. And looking for bonuses and desserts is second. What makes a global majority today from other countries with some geographical indicators, lack of perception of development as a threat. 8% of growth you want, you get 4% for India, for Turkey, for Ethiopia, for Nigeria. It's a question of their security, because this imperative is due to having 45 to 60% of younger generation. Any containment, limitation on technologies, technology transfer is artificial impediments in the way of growth and development. One other reason why it is important to consider and why development plays such a serious role in the global majority development, because it linked not only to the demographic factor but generational imbalance on the part of the West. Demography as such does not determine anything. I came across interesting numbers. In 330 years ago, the empire of great Mughals. Today, if we add up India, Pakistan and Bangladesh to one comma, it's the same 23%. The second is the empire of Sin and China, 22%. 300 goes 18% today. Even Russia. And then Moscovia was 2%, now 1.8%. These countries have had different lives during these 300 years, but the average life expectancy is a different category. You need to have rest homes for the elderly, or you have testing grounds for educating the youth. We need to do what we can cooperation in energy, water and food security for basic needs, the technologies for leaps forward, digital new materials, agenda for cooperation. Russia and the world, our global majority, is a more complex issue. Much has been said why we are together, military resource core. For understandable reasons, we're not so much focused on the development imperative. We have a different population structure. We still have a rigid migration policy, something that is subject to change. But Russia is an inexcludable player in energy, food security, water, technological cooperation, and important for Russia to be involved in this constructive agenda. How can this look, this political economic cooperation? Number one, new systems, new networks, new grids should be based on distributed control. It will not be just one switch. To have one single switch will not be of interest to anybody. The second, joint common ownership of ports, hubs, common representation and certification chambers and centers for technological transfer inside countries of the global majority, diffusion of technology, diffusion of development, and a greater reliance on national markets and production centers, manufacturing centers. Speculators should be much closer to consumers and producers, and desirably coming from the same countries. I think it's quite a possible story. There are resources, human resources, investment, prerequisites in major countries of the global majority, but there's a serious chance it may not happen. 300 years ago it did not happen, despite good demographies, but external conditions push countries to cooperate more than before. Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Likachova. I'm inspired by the way the discussion is evolving. We are identifying sets and blocks of intellectual endeavor about what the global majority is or global south. We have Fyodor Lukyanov among us. Among other things, he's a research professor of HAC and the editor-in-chief of the best journal in Russia in international politics and world economy, Russia and global policy. I hope that based on this discussion, you'll have a publication in your journal. Can this happen? I think it will, judging by this active, tempestuous start and flying start. I give the floor to the old friend. He's a young person, but very bright, Chinese intellectual. Mr. Van, you've been with us for so long. Now, looking at you, I did understand you are young. How can it be that we've known you for 15 years or so as a leading Chinese intellectual, and you're still a very young person? It is with great pleasure that we'll listen to what you have to say, because China is a special part, like all of us, of this global majority. You're welcome.
Thank you. Looks very young, but not very young. Nearly 50 years old.
I always try to sell this, they don't buy.
But Chinese, most of Chinese majority looks young, but I'm nearly 50 years old. So thank you. Thank you for your kind of introduction. Actually, sometimes, just like, majority, sometimes our thinking, it's always influenced by the outside face. Just like you described me, it's very young, but I become the dean for 11 years. It's old dean. But sometimes our thinking are influenced by those Western media, because the narrative was always controlled, dominated by the Western media. That's true nowadays. But so that's why I think today the topic majority, we're talking about reality, real conditions of a global majority are very, very important. So I think that I think we at least have three kinds of myths or three kinds of misunderstandings of a global majority. First is that at least in China, still a lot of people, they think that the West still dominate the world order. I think this is very wrong. Actually, the total economy value of the West only account for about 40% of the world, and their contribution to the world economic growth is less than 25%. About 60% of the global trade has nothing to do with the G7. More than 60% of the global trade, and none can the West dominate the energy order or security order. So I think it's really the end of the power of the West, to my honest. Of course, we admit that the power of the West is still very strong, but compare with the condition after World War II, or especially at the end of the Cold War, the hegemony of the West is really at the end, and this is the majority. And second thing, I think that in China, a lot of people, at least I share with you, to my honesty, a lot of Chinese people think that West democracy is a common value of the world. I think this is wrong. Actually, the majority thinking is that peace and development are the mainstream value in the world. Compare with Samuel Huntington. He wrote a very famous book, The Third Wave of Democracy, in 1970s. Nowadays, I think the world's majority views on Western democracy today, on democracy, I think today are no longer dominated by the West. That's why I think last week when United States hosted the Global Democracy Summit. You know, in China, when I teach in my university, all my students said that such a democracy summit, just like a joke. And I think most developing countries have formulated a long-term development vision, such as Saudi 2030, and the Africa Vision 2063. Right? Most of the countries, they have the long-term vision. Of course, China has the 2035 vision and the 2050 vision. So as peace is the foundation of all development. So to my honest, I will think that most of countries hope that maybe the conflict between Russia and Ukraine could be peaceful as soon as possible. And third point I want to share with you is that independent development. Independent development is rich of the most country, and reduce dependence on the other countries, especially reduce dependence on the West, has become the development strategy of most countries in the world. So maybe some people will think about Antasa, you are talking about that it's a localization or it's a deglobalization, but I call it independent development. So I think most of the but the real condition is that most of the developing countries, they just push their own development strategy of de-westernization and de-dollarization, especially in recent years. So I think that's why I mentioned that today another key topic, another term, the new international order, are very interesting. For China foreign strategy is also to promote the construction of the new international economic order and promote the reform of the global governance. But in my opinion, in China views that the so-called new international order should be one world centered on the United Nations, not one world centered on the West. So the rule of the rules of the new international order should be based on the UN Charter rather than the Western rules. So in this regard, I think the China foreign policy is very clear. China wants peace, not war. China wants UN, not US. This is a very important reason that why China hopes that the conflict between between Russia and Ukraine will end as soon as possible. And at the same time, China didn't agree with the sanctions imposed on Russia by the Western country. So my conclusion is that, in fact, the so-called new international order in China views is a kind of the historical return. Because after the end of the World War II, those intelligence people in 1945, in 1944, they established the international economic order, international financial order, international trade order, such as World Bank, IMF, or GATT, now it's a WTO. So I think those international traditional systems is not outdated. So on the contrary, it's the United States, and to my honest, it's the Soviet Union, the two superpowers many years ago, who have not fully respected the UN order in the past 70 years. So nowadays, the US power-centered realistic international order is outdated. So what we need to be done now is to return to the history at the end of the World War II and recognize the UN, United Nations, as an institutional platform for deal with international difference and contradictions. That's my views. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Professor Wang. We have started to have a discussion, as you may have noticed. Professor Wang inherits from 4,000 years of a civilization that is China. And that's why he is conservative, although And Professor Trenin, inherits to a 1,000-year-old civilization. That's why he's suggesting that we need to bring a new United Nations around BRICS, and Mr. Wang is saying that we need to build the old UN. And let's continue this discussion and see who's right, who's wrong, and history will say. And there is a lot of students here who will be able to make the judgment who is right in this discussion that is beginning, this dispute that is beginning. And now it is my pleasure to give the floor to Professor Maharaj. He's a great intellectual. And he is the utmost and number one scholar of Africa. And his thoughts are so bright. I've read him many times. And he is the epitome of the new world, with great ideas that we in the old world were not daring enough to put forward. Mr. Maharaj, please go ahead. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, and thanks for such a kind and warm welcome. I hope you have not set the bar too high by raising those points in that order. But it's also true, because we are, or I am, a product of a country which, amongst those that are around the table, is one of the youngest in world systems. So to that extent, many of the reflections draw from the painful process of trying to change a system that was not working to our advantage. And in that, I hope, and our colleague Dmitry Trenin also notes, even in Russia, we had many badges that people put saying majority rule in South Africa. It was one of the slogans of struggle. And that also speaks to what it is we need to pay attention to in how we understand what's happening in contemporary times. So I want to start by quoting from a famous institution that we often deride. It's the World Bank. And the World Bank makes a report in 2022 called Poverty and Shared Prosperity Report. Yeah, this is seen as a flagship report. But the message in the report is absolutely shocking. 47% of the world's human population survive on less than $6.85 a day. Yeah? So maybe, I know currency issues are troubling. It's 559 Russian rubles. It's 125 South African rands. Yeah? In the South African context, this monetary value is significantly less than the national minimum wage. And remember, the minimum wage is for those in employment. Yeah. South Africa's expanded unemployment rate is estimated to be 42.6%. In other words, we only have, out of a population of 60.6 million people, 15.9 that are earning wages or an income derived from selling their labor. So, under an unemployment within a system that is premised on wage labor to survive is something that we really need to consider in terms of how we engage about a global majority. We cannot exclude this fact, because this is humanity we talk about, yeah? 8.2 billion of us. So, if that system perpetuates itself, it becomes a core structural component. Defining the global majority also then needs to take into account, as colleagues have raised already, the massive incapacity of the current political economy to absorb people into socially meaningful labor. As colleagues have already mentioned, supported by scientific and technological advances, which largely originate, and we've seen the evidence for this, in public investments in research and development. Yet the benefits are captured, and these are not then translated into improving quality, quantity, accessibility of public goods and services, such as access to clean water, energy, education. We can carry on a long list whereby an overwhelming majority of peoples at world systems are excluded. The these countries and their national economies are constrained due to structural weaknesses that are continuously exaggerated through increasing levels of indebtedness. So after COVID-19, if you look at Africa's balance sheet, very few African countries, all 55, have the ability to pay for improving their public health systems or any other offering, because that money has been consumed in terms of paying for vaccines and other elements through loans. And those loans are not to their advantage. Yeah? So it becomes quite difficult for these societies to argue that they've benefited from the recent cycles of globalization, when the citizens, when the publics in these countries are immiserized, face poverty, and in essence, through financialization, are de-linked from production and distribution. So overwhelmingly, this is something we need to account for in terms of how we define a global majority. The primacy of these contradictions finds resonance in increases in exclusion, social angst, and protests. I'm sure we've all seen this now in the newspapers as well. It's not just in what was called the Global South, the Third World, or anything outside of the capitals of Europe. It's in fact in the capitals of Europe that we are seeing these protests. Paris was burning just a week ago. And it's important we draw this, the peoples constitute part of this majority. I must say, if you don't mind, it's just a sad fact that they hold those passports. And in embracing this, it's important also then, this collective West continues to operate on its own processes of affording certain entrants access into a system. And our colleague from India mentioned some of the forums through which such entry is afforded. Now we need to ask ourselves, if we are inside a structure called the G20, is it based on the majority? Or are all 20 economies treated equivalently? You see, I raise this because, as you heard from our ambassador earlier, South Africa is there as proxy for Africa. It cannot be 66 million people representing a continent of 1.2 billion people. Huge differences exist. And this is what we need to embrace if we want to constitute a global majority that has agency and the capacity for bringing about transformation. The global domination by minority of interests continued to generate, as it's outlined in your paper, military technological monopolies, and also the maintenance of core periphery inequities. In considering the emergence of an alternative international order, it's important also that we recognize efforts were made previously. If you look at the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, look at the processes in the early 70s, these were attempts to establish a new international order. We have to better appreciate why they failed so we don't reproduce the same mistakes in terms of what we are doing now. So I jump towards the end here. We must really ensure the defense of gains achieved through the struggles of ordinary people against exploitation and injustice. This is core, and we need to reflect it, whilst encouraging regional and international cooperation and collaboration. The African Integration Initiative is critically important, not because of how it's framed, but all of you know those 55 lines are not of Africa's making, yet we are expected to make them work as economies. These are not possible, and that's what we'll learn. We can ill afford to fail in our tasks and really must embrace more engaged critical scholarship like the work that's being suggested to offer better prospects for nurturing the global majority and through that advancing a more progressive new international order. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you. We are continuing. Ms. Likachova, our great students have to decipher our today's discussion and then we will publish a lot of that in Russia in Global Policy, and it would be great if, on the basis of this discussion, we will order or commission a book. We'll ask our authors and other participants of our conference to do that, because we have been avalanched by great and bright ideas, because this is really an intellectual feast. And now it is my great pleasure to give the floor to Professor Desai, who, despite being so young, she's really a classic scholar. She has given back to what we're doing its real, true meaning. We're not involved in international affairs, nor are we involved in world economics. We are involved in world political economy, and Ms. Desai has been doing this for the last 20 years, and she has been taking us back to the roots of our science, of our field of research. We couldn't tear what we were doing apart into little pieces or little schools. We only have one school, the School of Global Political Economy. And we have the pleasure of listening to one of the key individuals who is returning this school to us, following in the steps of the great thinkers of the 18th and the 19th century. Thank you. The floor is yours.
I've heard a lot about it. This is my first time, so thank you very much. The title of my talk is US Sanctions as a Symptom of Imperial Decline. And really what I have to say is to show you how the current situation with sanctions reveals some important things about the changes that are taking place in the world. The US-led West's proxy war may have made Russia the most sanctioned country in the world. However, it has also exposed the impotence of a declining imperialism. Sanctions intended to turn the ruble into rubble and take Russia back into the 19th century, both are expressions of President Biden. These sanctions did not just fail to achieve their stated objectives, as they already have against far weaker opponents. They boomeranged on practically every front, imposing costs on Europe and the United States. Though sanctions were applied selectively and hypocritically, consider the fact, for example, that Russian gas still flows to Europe, that Russia's oil is selling at a cap which is set far higher than the rhetoric will have you believe. With Europe bearing the costs disproportionately, fissures in the Western alliance are already appearing, even as it keeps announcing new rounds of sanctions, which now fail even in their propaganda objectives, let alone achieving any real ones. So what are we to make of this? One stream of the literature on sanctions focuses on efficacy, usually concluding that sanctions generally fail in deterring the target states from undertaking this action that sanctions aim to prevent. If tiny Cuba still stands against more than 60 years of US sanctions, North Korea, Iran and Venezuela remain unbowed, they are hardly going to deter Russia and China. A second stream of literature documents their horrifying effects on civilians, particularly when wielded against poor societies. The literature on efficacy and effects is useful, but it is not enough. We need to unify them in what I have called a geopolitical economy approach, which I first proposed in my 2013 book of the same name. In this approach, nations are material, deeply and intricately involved in managing economies in the modern capitalist era, and that means in capitalist as well as non-capitalist economies. And this goes contrary to liberal prejudices. The motor that drives the relations of producing nations is the interplay of uneven and combined development, which is essentially imperialism and resistance to imperialism. Imperialism seeks to impose a complementarity of economic structures between the economically and technologically advanced imperial economies and the subordinated colonial and semi-colonial economies. The essence of anti-imperialism is resistance of countries who can resist such subordination by building a similarity of economic structures. Notwithstanding the might of imperialism, the latter efforts, that is to say the anti-imperialist efforts, have prevailed and they have made the world multipolar today. Since the 1917 Bolshevik Revolution, the actually existing socialisms of the 20th and 21st centuries can be seen as the strongest forms of anti-imperialism. And they made an indispensable contribution to weakening, albeit all too gradual, of imperialism since its 1914 peak. Originating in the imposition of colonial control of powerful imperial states against far weaker colonies, sanctions fit right into this narrative. Economic means had long been part of warfare. That's what siege warfare was, for example, about. The post-Napoleonic liberal century, however, was exceptional in world history, in that within Europe at least, war and commerce were kept resolutely apart, where effective safeguards were erected for the continuance of peaceful business even amid ferocious wars. But this century, as I say, was the exception. Economic measures made a comeback when Britain and its allies imposed a naval blockade on the Central Powers in the First World War. For all its devastating consequences for civilians of the blockaded countries, there is absolutely no evidence that this naval blockade affected the course of the First World War. Nevertheless, for the next several decades, the League of Nations unsuccessfully tried to prevent wars through economic means. After the Second World War, the UN Charter reserved the use of sanctions to the multilateral body, and unilateral sanctions, which were of course illegal, were also used sparingly. For example, Cuba was not spared. The United States imposed unilateral sanctions on Cuba. But they were used sparingly chiefly because the existence of communism placed serious limits on the power of the United States, the most enthusiastic user of unilateral economic sanctions. And I would say that the unilateral economic sanctions are a feature of US hegemony. I put it in heavy quotation marks. I have argued there has never been such a thing. Since the dissolution of the Soviet Union, however, we have seen the full flowering of the US penchant for using unilateral sanctions. To understand why, we must note that sanctions and economic warfare have long been the US's imperial signature, central to its non-territorial imperialism. For example, there was the old gunboat diplomacy imposed on various countries of the Western Hemisphere. There was the US's economic warfare against the UK to prevent it from supporting the South in the Civil War. There was the US demand for repayment of its war loans to its allies on the spurious grounds that the United States joined the war as an associate rather than an ally. And this forced Britain and France in turn to demand reparations from Germany, making the Second World War inevitable. Such economic warfare is of a piece with the US's lack of any serious military record. Consider the long list of its military failures: Korea, Vietnam, and then, after overrunning tiny Grenada and Panama, its inglorious strings of 21st century wars. Today, US sanctions are not any sort of kinder alternative to war. As the US's inability to undertake military effort diminishes with loss of technological superiority in arms, lack of a coherent strategic thinking, and the unpopularity of wars among US citizens, the impossibility of the US, for example, ever introducing the draft again, sanctions have become the principal means for US wars. Unfortunately for the US, sanctions, whose ineffectiveness among major capitalist powers was already clear in the First World War, are now ineffective even against lesser economies. Growing multipolarity increases both the vulnerability of the sanctioning countries. They are no longer all-powerful imperialists facing powerless colonized populations, and also increases the resilience of the sanctioned countries who are capable of great feats of industrial development in the face of adversity. The industrial development of both China and the Soviet Union are testimony to this. Soviet Union was also, of course, one of the first victims of economic sanctions of the West. The US continues imposing sanctions today chiefly from, I would say, a certain madness. As Nikolai Petrov points out, sanctions can be sold as an alternative to a war-weary nation. Remember, Donald Trump was elected in good part because he said he wasn't going to start any new wars. Without a clear way of measuring the success of sanctions, they can always be portrayed as successes, providing an escape from reality, from the reality of failure. And Nikolai Petrov goes further, and I'm quoting him now. Eventually, however, Petrov says, the political high provided by sanctions wears off. The nastiness of the world intrudes. Once again, politicians become desperate for another fix. Friends try to warn Americans that Washington's increasingly erratic behavior is beginning to hurt them as well. But how can they be expected to understand the burdens that the US must bear as the leader of the free world? This is what the US leaders tell themselves. Eventually, Petrov continues, as Americans' view of the world shrinks to the Washington Beltway, nothing but their own media-driven reality matters. Sanctions now provide the only semblance of calm, the only relief that politicians can rely on, and so resort to sanctions becomes habitual. Petrov's insight is far superior to what I see as, at least what the US academic world considers as the best US scholarship on sanctions that it has to offer. I'm speaking of Nicholas Mulder's book, The Economic Weapon. This book still inhabits the world of the liberal fantasy of the separation of the political from the economic. They do not understand the materiality of nations. And it remains bewildered by the great effect of sanctions, particularly on civilian lives, and their ineffectiveness in achieving their goals. Mulder blames this on the rise of, what he quotes, nationalism, fear-mongering, and virulent racism. All of this is put into one. He continues, ideals of cultural unity, historic rights to territory, and promises of self-determination and social transformation mobilized millions. Given the power of such ideas to move entire societies, how could economic pressure alone dissuade them from repeating such collective struggles? He asks. And then he concludes, sanctions would, he says, no doubt work better in a world of perfectly rational, consistently self-interested subjects, but that is not the world in which we inhabit. So he's basically saying that it's too bad the world consists of nation states, of countries that have some solidarity, some capacity to organize their own affairs. So one can only say that it is very poor scholarship that, having failed to predict the behavior of the actors under study, in this case nation states, resorts to accusing them of irrationality and even racism. Unable to recognize the materiality of nations, even such a major scholarly intervention fails to produce an explanation, leaving only a conundrum. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Desai. That was really fascinating, a powerful scholarly intervention. Was very elegant at the same time too. And now it is my pleasure to give the floor to Rakim Ashakbayev. He is an economist, a businessman, a political figure. He's the face of the new Kazakhstan. And if we're talking about the regular majority and not about the global elite, Mr. Ashokbay belongs to the global majority, because it can be colder in Kazakhstan than it can get in Russia. So he's the member of the global north and not the member of the global south. I cannot really say that after I was in Astana when the temperature was minus 40 C. That was lower than what I felt in Novosibirsk. It would be our pleasure to listen to your intervention. Thank you.
Please press the button. In Kazakhstan, you're right, it will be very cold. The second coldest capital after Ulaanbaatar in Mongolia. I will make a certain update on Kazakhstan, the current situation, and in the context of Kazakhstan, whatever has been discussed. Clearly, Kazakhstan has always been proud of pursuing its independent policy. The major international organizations is GSTO, European Economic Systems, Shanghai Organization, CICA, with the headquarters in Astana, and Kazakhstan initiative on security measures in Asia. In continuation of multi-vector policy, there have been many meetings, summits, emblematic visit of Xi Jinping, his first visit to Kazakhstan as a sign of priority that is given to Kazakhstan, active contacts with Erdogan in Kazakhstan last year, in this case. At the same time, CIS, our narrow part of the CIS, Central Asian Countries Summit, and overall, speaking about the economy, the key markets in terms of exports, it is EU countries where Kazakhstan is exporting its hydrocarbons and steel making. Importers are Russia and China, number one and number two. Now, the capacity for changing the structure of the economy is not to be seen. With regard to main investors, global minority countries are dominating. EU, US, Chevroil, Chevroil is a major taxpayer in the economy, account for 20% of all incomes in the budget. Switzerland, Belgium, Germany, UK, China, even less than Russia. In terms of investment, Russia is part of the top 5, but compared to global minority countries, so much less for Russia. Policy for attracting foreign investment is mainstream policy in Kazakhstan, and specifically and particularly Western countries. In February, our center conducted a survey on foreign policy and geopolitical preferences. 2,800 people covered. In fact, the earthquake in Turkey was same time, and there was a big deal of empathy to the victims of that earthquake, and Turkish was number one in the survey. We'll repeat the survey in April or May this year, and we'll see whether the bias was due to Turkish earthquake. Then China, Russia, other countries of Central Asia, Europe, and the United States. Overall, the population of Kazakhstan is more realistic than some members of the Kazakhstan elite, with regard to whom Kazakhstan should have relations on a priority basis. An important question was how, after 1 year, Kazakhstan treats the conflict of Russia with Ukraine, and who should be supported. We have this minority supporting Ukraine. Kazakhstan volunteers are sending material aid to Ukraine. At the same time, more or less same number are supporting in the survey Russia, and 60% are neutral in their response. I think these numbers do require some interpretation. Kazakhstan is trying to sit on two chairs at the same time, whether it's comfortable or not, I don't know. After visits of Western leaders, Kazakhstan said we will try to avoid secondary sanctions, and starting April there will be a mechanism of tracking and tracing commodity and goods trade with countries of Eurasian Economic Union. The existence of Eurasian Economic Union and the year where Russia adapted to the sanctions, Kazakhstan played no last role in organizing parallel imports in Russia's economy adaptation to the sanctions. Let me remind you that after the global world economic crisis, my neighbor says it was not a global crisis but transatlantic crisis. But nevertheless, in Российская газета there was an article by President Nazarbayev, keys to the crisis resolution. At that time it was seen as his compulsive writing. It was not treated seriously at the time. Nevertheless, when you reread the article, it is very topical, very relevant. And he says that we are on the verge of creating a radically new economy and global security. And Nazarbayev asked 7 simple questions, which became acute. The article's aim in saying that the existing global economy based on the single currency emission is not fair. And whether de facto global currency is legal de jure. Whether the second question, whether the issue of the world currency procedure is democratic. Third question is the mechanism of balancing demand and supply of the world currency is comparative and free. And is the market for the world currency civilized? Whether the system of generation and emission of world currency are controlled by major countries' users or the world community at large. And he suggested a new reserve currency to be created that will be emitted based on fairer basis. All Greek, called Acme, the highest stage. Our ancestors will probably use this name. Perhaps Akmeta should be the name of the new currency, and the motor, the engine for the new economy, with the world capital, the global capital based on the new defect-free currency. And based on this, I'm concluding this part, that Kazakhstan has some historical accomplishments with regard to visionary effort and with regard to new architecture for Greater Eurasia. Eurasian Economic Union, 14 years in existence after this article of Nazarbayev. In terms of visionary quality, he hit right on target. The world needs a new world currency that would be based on fairer multilateral conditions. At the same time, by way of inertia, Kazakhstan continues the policy without any alternatives or options, but at the same time Kazakhstan is in the triangle, which United States and Europe call it the new alliance, not an axis of evil, I will call it, and Russia, China. Kazakhstan, I would suggest, it is heart and soul is not part of the global majority, is more connected with the West. In terms of investment, in terms of capital and owners, and most importantly, the mode and mentality of the elite. A major achievement that this conflict between Russia and Ukraine has brought about is nationalization of elites, which did not happen in Kazakhstan. Their future, their pensions, retirement phase is in the West for Kazakhstan elite. And when our partners try to understand what the new policy should be with regard to Kazakhstan and Central Asia, we say we should not expect that Kazakhstan will become part of anti-coalition, like anti-Iran, anti-Russia. Leave Kazakhstan as a jurisdiction, as an opening window for trade, for economic interaction with Greater Eurasia. The contradictions are there. Economically and mentally, Kazakhstan is part of the West and in the center of the global majority at the same time. This conflict is becoming more acute. In Kazakhstan, there is a mainstream thing is the anti-colonial discourse, not as part of anti-imperialism globally. That vision that part of the problems that Kazakhstan was part of the USSR, part of the Russian Empire. What will happen if we overcome this mentality and mindset? And hence the narratives about the renaming. There's a special commission. It's an active government policy, infringement of the rights of the Russian language speakers, xenophobia to Russian speakers. This conflict is intriguing. How can Kazakhstan overcome this mutually exclusive trends and sitting on two chairs at the same time? The major battlefield is in the world trade, world currency and financial ideas, and the relations and battle of ideas. A year ago, in June last year, at one conference in Washington, D.C., I heard hawks like John Bolton, and at the same time people who said that the United States overdid, like Carlos Guterres, former director of trade, Department of Trade. He said that sanctions may harm more the existing order, which actually happened. In my view, this hyper response on the part of the United States, and I agree with Dr. Desai, they imparted and did global and irreversible harm. And most countries apply virtually this to themselves, and they see they don't like it. And that's the erosion of fundamental basis why the West was an attractive model, the right of ownership. Nobody can be deprived of the right of ownership, contested trials, disputes, proof of guilt. So the main thing is racism, if you like. Nobody should be discriminated against based on race or nationality. Again, this age-long argument between Westerners and Slavophiles in Russia is more or less in favor of Russian identity, which I can't believe myself. Probably this Western identity will come back. This battle of ideas, humanism. There is a shortage of some tangible images for the future, something where we should be involved in this whole battle of ideas about the future. Thank you very much. I can see the struggle that we had inside us a few years ago, and I think you'll move the Eurasian way. Unless you move the Eurasian way, which you suggested and proposed, the new Eurasian idea is the idea that came from Nazarbayev. It's true. Kazakhstan can be torn apart unless you do that. But I think you will move not against the West, but where you belong. You will come back home like we are coming back home. And you're to a great extent at home in Eurasia where we are. But we came back there and we will not leave it together with you. Now, my friends, let us continue this discussion. Not as Q&A, but a seminar. We have 20 to 30 minutes. I suggest that we speak, give comments, criticize. It's not a press conference, though. It's a scholarly event. Anybody willing to say something, criticize, challenge, add, you're welcome. Introduce yourself. Good afternoon. I'm Samir Kadyrov, third-year student of International Relations Department. Most of the speakers are my teachers, Likhachova, Karaganov. And my first question is to Dr. Wang. I can express it in English to prove the quality of English.
Dear Mr. Wang, what, in your opinion, is Chinese perspective on current conflict between Russia and the West? In my opinion, that's a great repetition of what might take place in maybe decade around Taiwan problem. So this pressure, which is done to Russia by the West, is, in my opinion, the repetition of what might be done towards China when it tried to restore its territorial integrity and solve the Taiwan problem. So the question is, why then China is still keep its neutrality towards Russia? It's friendly neutrality, of course, but it's still neutrality that isn't in favor to Russia and isn't in favor to the Chinese Republic in a long-term perspective. Thank you very much.
Thank you very actually now we could do both English and Russian. I hope our interpreters will handle that. But I will continue in Russian. Да, я соберу несколько замечаний и потом вернусь.
I will collect a few comments and questions. You wanted to say something. Introduce yourself. Bolotnikov Vladimir, head of from the Academy of Social Management, director of a research center. I'm inspired by the dean's words. Demography 300 years ago, demography today. In English Wikipedia, 20% of world wealth was ascribed to the Empire of Great Mongols, 20% to China. My question is to those who will find it pertinent to answer. Of course, I would like to hear our Indian colleague view. Establishing on a new basis of this, having the world, majority of world wealth in the hands of the world global majority should be in the interest of India, I think. How could one initiate and stimulate, not only economically, but economically, technologically, a domination of global majority over those who try to limit that global majority?
Thank you very much for your question. There was an answer within your question. One last question or comment, and then we'll go on. Please, go ahead. Did someone want to ask a question? I can see someone raising a hand over there, yes. Please introduce yourself. Press the button first in front of you.
Please, I'm Lawrence from Ghana. In this multipolar system that Russia wants to bring together with the BRICS, I want to ask this question. There have been a hegemony of US-controlled institutions like the IMF, the WHO, and other institutions. So, what is the BRICS agenda of breaking such hegemony? And then my second question is, after the introduction of the petrodollar in the early 1970s, we could realize that most of the global transactions are being done in the dollar. So what do BRICS have in mind, or plan to break that hegemony as well? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let us respond to these questions that have been asked. Anastasia, you may go first. Or maybe General Sharma, you will be first.
Thank you for that question. I'm a military man and I cannot even count my own pay. So to answer how India should, sort of revolutionize its economy, I can only make an intelligent guess and not give you a very authoritative response to that. See, till 18th century, together with China, I think we were the number 2 economy in the world. I think we were almost 23% of the world GDP was being contributed by India. And till the colonization took place and how they plundered our wealth and everything, that's a story by itself. Now India is at the cusp of a major economic transformation. And we are using in a significant way technology for promoting internal consumption in a very big way. Our economy to a large extent is decoupled from global economy. That's why we've been able to withstand the rigors of strategic shocks. But it's time that India is opening up. And the charity begins at home. And what India is doing, there is a digital revolution which is taking place in India, how we digitally manage our economy and become internally a very, very consuming economy so that we don't have to rely too much on import and exports to give an impetus to our economy. At the same time, there are these mobility, transportation corridors which are being developed within India, outside India, connecting it with our neighborhood so that India becomes an important vector or an anchor of regional economic integration within Indian Ocean region and South Asia. That's a major drive. And now we are reaching out in terms of free trade agreements with ASEAN, with some of our South Asian countries, even with Europe. And we're looking forward very keenly towards Eurasia, Russia, particularly to be a competitive player in the Eurasian economic space. And that is why we're interested in these mobility, the transportation corridors to come through. Well, there is always a discussion in India whether we did a wise thing by staying out of regional comprehensive economic cooperation, which is a bloc of 15 countries. So that's a question that we need to address, that in times to come should India go back to RCEP and become part of that growth story. We've also evinced certain interest in tying up with Eurasian Economic Union, which Russia is heading. And I think our candidature is under consideration. I think some strides would have been made in this direction because of this Ukraine conflict, and I'm sure we will be able to revisit and move in that direction. On the whole, today we are the 5th largest economy in the world, and if we go by the existing trend of about 7% growth, in another decade or so, we would be the 3rd largest economy, and sky is the limit. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. It is especially pleasant for me to hear from the General that he didn't mention the role of military power in reasserting India. If India had power from military back in the 19th century, then it wouldn't have become a colony. Now you are rebuilding your military. And the world majority cannot exist if it is not strong multipolarly in the military sense of this word. And that's why India is getting stronger, and the same thing goes with other countries. But it's not to fight with each other, but to counter attempts to butt heads with others. And that is what some nations are being prodded to do, and that is also true in the case of India. But I'm sure that we will resist this trend all, to be honest with you. I wanted to comment on something else. Some of the participants mentioned what is happening with the United Nations now. The further we go, the more we see that the United Nations, as a global structure capable of preventing conflicts, has failed in this role. As a structure that has an effective policeman function, it has also failed in that sense, if we're talking about peacemaking efforts. But if we look at a structure that in the next 10 to 15 years would be putting out fires in various parts of the world, I don't see why Russia couldn't be a country that would push for an active reform of the United Nations. This would mean expanding the mandate for global rescuers, and that would be quite appropriate, and that would not prevent Russia from advancing its agenda in this organization, and would really change the weight of the countries, large countries of the global majority. And the United Nations should understand that its role has changed and it's become more modest, and we may be the ones who would play a role in this, or should deal with that. If I may, I would like to respond to what you've said about the reform of the United Nations. The UN had never functioned as it had been devised. It did work, nevertheless, amidst the conditions it was in, especially during the Cold War. But as a structure and a part of the architecture, it was founded on the ground that was created by a bipolar world. But nowadays, this soil, this ground, has been eroded, it's gone, and there's no such ground that any organization can rely on. The world is changing, the world is moving faster and faster. We should be thinking about a UN reform, and Russia should be advancing the idea of expanding the number of, or let's put it this way, should advance the idea of reforming the Security Council by including there such countries, leading countries as India, by ensuring that such continents as Africa are better represented there. And the same goes for Latin America. And that is very important, and that is what Russia's foreign policy should include. And of course, the representation of West, which has been overly present there, is an anachronism. But this is something that is a task for the future. The United Nations should not be disbanded in Russia's thinking, but at this time, we cannot really count on the United Nations to perform the function that you've outlined. Or it would be unwise to do that, because, putting out fires, well, okay, let's say the United Nations is trying to intervene in the Ukraine conflict, and what is going to happen? It is not capable of doing that. It was never capable of doing that prior to the conflict, although it supported the Minsk agreements prior to that, at least on the formal basis. But when it turned out that the Minsk agreement, and it turned out that that's the case quite a while ago, that the Minsk agreement had not been fulfilled, because the Western countries are not pushing for that, including the United States. Then, of course, no UN's agreement with the Minsk agreement had no meaning to begin with. So this military security role of the United Nations, now that the world is split and is more divided, this role is unfortunately inaccessible to us. And the last point I wanted to make is that when I said that the BRICS is the United Nations of the future, I didn't mean that literally. What I meant to say is that the new principles that this new world order will be founded on, they can be created, they can be tested out on the BRICS platform so that the majority could come to this new conference of creating this global majority system. Professor Wang was talking about 1944 and 1945 when they were creating the United Nations. And once we've resolved this problem of this hybrid war, then we would create a new system and the principles that will have been developed as part of BRICS, SCO, RIC, and other fora and organizations. Those principles could be in demand and sought after. I wanted to add to what Dmitry said when he spoke about what we need to use to create the institution of a greater majority. We need to create a new type of an OECD, something that would commission studies in the fields of social studies, the club of the most developed nations with voluntary principles. And I was once involved in allowing Kazakhstan to join several conferences and organizations. I represented the Science and Technology Committee of Kazakhstan, and such an organization is a great forum for taking good advantage of the scientific potential of these cultures, of these countries. And now that the policies are being eroded, we need some supra-national center that would develop advanced practices, best practices, and would allow third world countries, countries of the global majority, to get access to those technologies and take advantage of this. Because right now that we want to create a better social policy, we don't see a better alternative to the OECD. Especially now when the monetary policy requires that it is reconsidered and rethought in a major way. And as we try to wean ourselves off of the dollar, we need to decide what should be the right exchange rates that we would be operating with if we come to a new currency. What kind of things we're going to do if we want to fight off the inflation. So we would need to select a course that would allow us to get rid of the consequences of such an inflation, and so on and so forth. Thank you.
Whenever they ask where to invest, although I am an economist, I don't know. The only thing I'm sure of, we can invest in chopping wood, firewood, and vodka. Whether it will save you, I'm not sure. We need intellectual breakthroughs. We need to leave that older paradigm. You're welcome. Fyodor? With regard to the United Nations, that's a favorite topic. We have this unusual perspective. We, I mean Russia, are confusing two components which are different. One is for what the Security Council was set up the way it is. It's the ability of major powers to block decisions that power would be against instead of a world war. And this function is important, probably the main function. But there was a second element which we did not publicly discuss, but it's there. It's prestige, exclusivity. We have 5 countries that have enjoyed this right of veto, and that's it. No one else should try. It was clear why these countries had this veto, but there was 77 years ago or so. Today, to respond to the claims of this majority of countries, why these undemocratic countries, there's nothing to say. It so happened, it's so involved. They have different views, but they all believe others are not handsome enough, or pretty enough. I think the second element has lost its significance now, because we are discussing here the global majority. We are for qualitative improvement of world democracy in international relations. And Russia should say, let us expand the Security Council security. Let the Security Council in the United States have many countries with the veto power and veto right that can prevent decisions that they are not happy about, not to abolish the right of veto, because otherwise it's a path to war, institutionalized path to war. But if we have 10 countries of the global majority, or not even not of global minority, who will apply this right of veto, that's fine. The UN institutions that are Anglo-Saxon, it's not the developing countries' idea or Soviet Union's idea. Another thing that the Soviet Union, when the United Nations was created, had such weight internationally that it was not an issue for the Soviet Union, not a problem. But now, if we say that all institutions are crumbling, why not? I think Russian diplomacy should be actively pursuing this line. We are demanding a reform of the Council of Security for many countries to have the right to have a say, a voice. I will agree with you, since I'm the oldest among you in this. I've been in this argument for the past 40 years. For 30 years, Russia was against expansion of the Security Council because of prestige, I think. But I feel that now we shall change, modify our position as Russia. The problem about the United Nations is not those are acutely needed to expand the permanent membership, in the Security Council. There's another issue, which is more important even. In the United Nations, in agencies, the West dominates in agencies, officials, bureaucrats. In parallel, we should go back to Dmitry Trenina's idea, to create additional or parallel structures for economic development, healthcare, and other areas. That would be in the interest of the global majority. Such entities are being created. The Asian Bank, I think, is lending 5 times more than the World Bank, or something like that. But we should pursue this line on. A micro comment on what is to be done with institutes. There is this divine city of Rome, which is the food agricultural headquarters. But that's a blasphemy. Anyone who visited Rome, the last thing you can talk about, the last place to discuss famines is Rome. The headquarters for the organization should be Ethiopia, Addis Ababa.
Back to your questions. For China perspective on the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, I think our judgment.
Slow down, please, so that the translation will follow you. Okay, a bit slower.
I think our judgment, China judgment, based on the world majority. I think the world majority thinking on the conflict is like hope to achieve the peace as soon as possible. That first. Second is most of the countries in the world disagree with sanctions from the West. So that's why President Xi visiting Russia. I think it means the huge trust with Russia and try our best to push the peaceful solution. But in my opinion, I think it's very, very difficult to stop the conflict, to my honestly. I think my judgment on my personal judgment on the conflict, like maybe they will produce like the new conditions of India and Pakistan, similar to India and Pakistan condition on Kashmir. I think a very long term, maybe 1 decade or 2 decades, a long term to do it. So you have to, it's a long term conflict, to my honest. Why? Because the U.S. For USA is the biggest winner. To keep the tension between the Russia and the Ukraine, it's hugely benefited to the U.S. It separated Russia and Europe, and then of the balance strategy on Russia. That's my judgment for your reference. And also my about Taiwan. But China, to my honesty, in China, hundreds of Chinese scholars, we observe the conflict. And also we learn a lot. For example, Russia side, you have the very strong anti-section strategy. And also on the currency war, I'm seeing Russia is very, very strong. We also learn a lot from Russia. But on the military war, I think China mainland on Taiwan, we keep the patience. I think it's a long-term competition too. I think the key point is to how to deal with the United States. So now we think that in the coming years, we try our best to push our GDP to surpass United States. I think in 2030, 2032, maybe in the coming 8 years or at maximum 10 years, China's GDP will surpass United States. Then I think a lot of structure will be changed. And we think Taiwan is very near from us. Taiwan cannot be moved away. So I think we think that time belongs to us. As long as our power, China's GDP, or maybe military power, to my honest, in 5 years, China will have 6 aircraft ship. And also maybe we will 7 aircraft ship. And with military power, economic power, can balance with the United States. I think there are times the Taiwan people, they will cry to the mainland China, "Oh, mother, take me back." I think this is our confidence to peaceful solution on Taiwan issue. Yeah, thank you.
So, thanks very much, and thanks to the colleagues for asking the question. I want to just pick up on this gap between surface appearance and reality. So, it's quite important that we recognize. Last week there was a headline in a newspaper in Ghana saying Nkrumah turns in his grave. And that was because of the deployment of AFRICOM in Africa in conflict. We have an African Union resolution against foreign troops. The French have violated it for a long time, but they're in the process of being pushed out. So how is it that this relationship now changed in that way? Why I'm raising it in that form, one of the persons who proposed to the National Liberation Movements that there should be no foreign troops was Nkrumah. You see, so we have to be careful over time how things change, and because of that, its impact. In a similar way, the next question that was asked about data, and I think we had a chat about this before. When we decompose data going backwards, in history, a lot of that derives from Angus Madison's work, the late Angus Madison, and we assume it is valid. So we have to ask the question, we use the word global majority, global south, third world, etc. How much of that data comes from our scholarship based on how we measure our own economies itself? This is an important point in terms of how we understand the future arising from our present. We must claim ownership back. If we don't direct it, we are victims to it. So the last point associated with that is much of that data is not true cost data. In other words, there's huge provision for externalities, and the externalities included slavery, indentured servitude, a whole range of issues like that that have been wiped out of history and the books because of it. So when we talk decolonization, it's important. Decoloniality, our current practice, helps us redress what we've inherited from the past. And I think HSE has the possibility of investing in such research. Thank you.
Да, мы можем продолжить. Мне не хочется завершать.
We could continue. I don't want to finish this meeting, but we have worked not just 2 hours, but 2 hours and a quarter. If somebody wants to speak, I will give the floor. But other people in HSE will be jealous, and other panels will be jealous. Ms. Desai, of course, please. Let's talk for 15 minutes at least. Microphone.
It's certainly true that that the UN system needs considerable reform. 5-member Security Council is no longer enough, all those things. However, I think it's important also not to forget the historic moment at which the UN was created. I agree that the UN was an Anglo-Saxon institution, undoubtedly. At the same time, it occurred at a moment in history when they had to admit the Soviet Union and China, although for too long the seat was given to Taiwan rather than the People's Republic, but we'll forget that. But the Soviet Union and China had to be included in this club. And what that tells us is that already at that time, the world had become sufficiently multipolar for the United Nations to have the architecture that it does. And so while, as I say, I agree that it needs reform, I think the principles of, because remember that what was the situation? Number one, the all European powers had fought themselves to exhaustion, which then gave the United States a premier position, although it was not capable of using it wisely, but we'll leave that aside. Communism now extended from Prague to Pyongyang, and that is a huge swath of the earth. And thirdly, the so great revolt against the West among the colonized countries had come of age. It was inevitable that decolonization would take place. The communist countries were going to support it, and this meant the United Nations would have to have a very democratic structure. And the fact that it had a democratic structure with the recognition of equal sovereignty, non-interference, all those principles of the UN Charter, this was so abhorrent to the imperialist countries that they went off and formed NATO as a rival organization, because they knew, they hate the UN. Every time they go to the UN, they have to look at the representatives of poor countries in the world, telling them off, Hugo Chavez talking about sulfur and what have you when he gives his speeches. So they never liked that. That's why NATO exists. When NATO was created, there was no threat to the Western world. It was a completely invented threat, and the invented threat was it exists in order to preserve the imperial power of the West, and it is now declining. Anyway, so I just wanted to say that and that's why the organization that was recently created, I think it's called something like Friends of the UN Charter, of which I think Russia is a signatory. I think these are important initiatives, and I think these principles have to be borne in mind in any consideration of the reform of the United Nations. I think there's a question there, sir.
You're welcome.
There's a question over there.
Good. Yeah. I just wanted to ask, particularly Rasigan, but also others, about the issue of unequal development and unequal exchange. And this is the connection between economic development and conflict. Because conflict ultimately arrives when there is an inequality of development between countries who are trading. Because when they trade, if the country with a superior level of technology exchanges with a country with a lower level of development, there is going to be an inevitable transfer, if the market mechanisms are the only mechanisms involved, from the poor to the rich. That's the mechanism of imperialism. But within regional currencies, this is also important, and I refer particularly to the case, oddly enough, of Paraguay, with which I am familiar, that the attempt to cause by Hugo Chavez to create ALBA, the first attempt to create a sort of regional currency and developmental union, One of the things that made it very difficult was the disparity between nations within Latin America, because Paraguay is the poorest country in Latin America, right next to Brazil, which is one of the richest. And the exchange between them was very deleterious to Paraguay. For what is necessary is not merely state mechanisms for internal development, but state mechanisms for equalizing the exchange between poor and rich countries, which are developmentalist in character. Keynes proposed this, that if a country has a surplus, it should export that surplus to develop the poorer nation, and that is the most rational economic strategy, which is very contradictory for those who are schooled in neoclassical economics. So it seems to me that China is actually pursuing a policy which is devoted towards using its superior level of technology to raise the technology level of the rest of the world. And that seems to me a valid foreign policy for all parts of the global majority, which will affect the capacity to construct politically viable regional blocs on terms of parity of trade and parity of esteem.
We should be continuing. We have worked for 2.5 hours. Not bad. This has been a brilliant and very tasty intellectual meal and feast. And I thank everybody, all the speakers, those who challenged and criticized and asked questions. We shall continue with this work, and I'm sure that based on this discussion we'll have further research and we'll do it together. Let's have a book based on this current discussion that we've just had. And in conclusion, I would like to answer one of the questions asked during the discussion. Will Russia come back to the West? No. No, it will not come back. I'm one of the founders of the Institute of Europe, Russian Academy of Sciences, for many years, dealing professionally with the West. This happened 35 years ago. I founded the Institute of Europe. It's dull there, boring. His discussion is so much more interesting and tasty. We should not and need not come back. It's more interesting here, more exciting. There's the youth and the future. Thank you very much.